You're so, this one is entitled Lecture 22.
Lecture 22.
Lecture 21.
Well, speaking of numbers, good morning, everyone. I told all of our audience members today, and I had to tell them in mass all at once because there's so many people in the class that I couldn't tell them individually, that on the board, we have all of the remaining information through Thanksgiving break, which is next week. Next week, we are off completely. Today, we're going to be covering the left blue inked part of the board, lecture 25, 16 November, and then next Thursday, obviously, in 2 days, we'll be covering the right side, A, B, and C, the German Spring Offensive, America's entry in 1918 unto Armistice Day, November 11th. The overall kind of umbrella of these two lectures, truly and appropriately, is 1918 East and West, the final year of the war. Those of you that have been keeping up online, and thank you for doing that, we've reached the end of the class, basically in a certain sense, because what I told people before the class started, when we return from Thanksgiving, is back to thematic style lectures. A biography of Blessed Emperor Karl. We're going to talk about the Versailles settlement, which parses out, what all this was about, right? Which is the peace treaty that ends the war, which, if I'm not mistaken, is signed 5 years to the day of the assassinations in Sarajevo, June 28th, 1919. We'll talk about the Spanish flu. As today, we don't have any photos for you. There's going to be no slideshow. For the Spanish flu, it'll be the opposite of that, kind of making up. It'll be really interesting to see people masking, people, the social distancing protocol. Please keep away from your neighbor. Very creepy in a certain sense of history, perfectly repeating itself in terms of the social reaction to the pandemic then and now, which, again, those of you that have been keeping up know what I'm going to say next. This is just, again, another example of so much of our modern and postmodern world, the seeds of being found in the Great War period. I think that's been proven countless times throughout this class, how much of what we believe, do, think, experience now, often people went through it for the first time then, 100 years ago. Today, we're talking about Operation Faustschlag. Anyone know what this word means? And this is very, very appropriately named. So again, today, and also appropriately as well, I said 1918 East and the West. Yeah, we're going to talk about the East today, the Eastern Theater. This is the close of the East. Before I go back to ask you what Operation Faustschlag means, remember, by January 1st, 1918, Russia is out of the war for all intents and purposes, you can say. They're still in it technically, but the Russian Revolution is already long underway. It's been completed. Back in November already, a couple months earlier, Lenin was issuing his proclamations, and the Tsar and his family are under house arrest at this time still. Sadly, though, in the summer of this year, they'll be all executed. They're still alive, but out of the picture. Kerensky is gone. The Bolsheviks are in full control. Russia is in total chaos and turmoil. Whereas Germany, which throughout the war, the history and the story of Germany has been constant victory, but an inability to really break through, right? An inability to either break out in Jutland out of the North Sea or break through in the Western Front at the start of the war and repeat 1870, or in the East to really finish off the Russians. Today, we're talking about that last point I just made, finishing off the Russians, finishing off the Eastern Front. All of the earlier success, if you remember, in the East of Gorlice Tarnów in 1915, or the battles of the Masurian Lakes, or we talk about the siege of Przemysl back and forth, right? And the first use of poisonous gas in Volymov, and the Tsar coming to the front in 1915. All of that story ends today for us in the Eastern Front. That's all we're focusing on today, is the Eastern Front. The second part of this 1918 end of the war, the West, is for Thursday. Operation Faustschlag literally means Operation Fist Punch. Okay, what are you going to say?
Slow foot.
The opposite of slow foot. Well, maybe like Theodore Roosevelt has said, speak softly and carry a big stick. Maybe Faustschlag is go with slow feet but fast fists. What's like that. You can walk slow as long as you punch hard. This is very simple, right? Operation Faustschlag, because to continue a boxing kind of analogy, we're trying to go for the knockout blow. Okay, Operation Fist Punch, TKO the Russians. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Number one of import, what is the date? When is this going on? It's weeks. It's very, very short. Remember Verdun? lasts from February through November, into December, even almost all of 1916. Remember, the Third Battle of Ypres is months from the summer, the blowing up of Messines Ridge, all the way through the battles of Passchendaele. This is February 18th to March 3rd. That's 2 weeks. This is very, very, very quick. And in fact, people have called it the 11 Days War, which is even more, less than 2 weeks, a week and a half. Now, the background, I have a couple things for you here, 2 and 3. All right, number 2 and 3 are both background points that I kind of alluded to already, but I'm going to allude to once more. Number 2, in Baltics, Ukraine, Belarus, in response to blank. In response to what? So wait a second. Operation Fist Punch, February, March of 1918, 11 Days War, taking place in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, especially Riga, the capital, Lithuania, Belarus, in response to what? Well, what is it specifically in response to? And I mentioned it earlier. Why are the Germans there? Why are they so far east? Because of the revolution, right? Because of the turmoil of the Russian Revolution. Because everything has been burned to the ground, reduced. Good morning, Claire. It has been reduced to nothing. The Germans are able to be, in fact, so far east. Fist punching so far east. Claire, in 5-second summation, we're finishing the war this week. Today, the Eastern Front, Operation Faustschlag, 11 Days War, that's how long it takes. Literally Operation Fist Punch, the Germans to knock out the Russians. That's what we're talking about today. And number 2, the reason it's going to be fought in these, what today would be referred to as Eastern Europe. If I was like, we're going to go to Ukraine and Belarus, that's Eastern Europe, that's Chernobyl area, that's Cyrillic alphabet. The reason it's so far, the Germans have advanced so far already is because the fill in the blank is the Russian Revolution. But what about earlier? Well, the Central Powers, as we get to the negotiation phase of what? Well, I'm jumping ahead now, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Don't worry about that now, you don't have to write it down yet, that's point number 9. That's going to be what will end formally, in a treaty sense, end the war in the East. The Germans are going to be demanding territory that they have occupied in this area already, going back to 1914. Remember the Battle of the First Masurian Lakes, and what is the most important victory in the East for the Germans? Right off the bat, August of 1914. What do they set as the template of what they will do to the Russians, which is basically constant victory, minus the Brusilov offensive? It's a lot of kind of unbroken string, seemingly so at least. Maybe not literally, but 95% of the engagements are seemingly won by the Germans. What's that first great battle the Germans win over the Russians?
Is it not those lakes?
Lakes are after.
That's after.
The first Masurian Lakes, I think, is September of 1914. The second Battle of Masurian Lakes is February 7th to 22nd of 15. So it's snow-covered, it's very cold. Tannenberg, remember Tannenberg? That's where Ludendorff, who is the hero, the door-knocking hero, surrendering the forts during the Battle of the Frontiers in Belgium, goes to the east, and him and Hindenburg together and Hoffman split the armies of Rennenkampf and Samsonov and deal the Russians their first massive blow. The German victory at Tannenberg in August of 1914 is arguably the first great victory of the Great War, even grander than the German push west through Belgium. And remember, after Tannenberg, this is where the general slept, this is where he ate, all the kind of bickering and fighting, blah, blah, blah. Despite all that, the Germans set an early template. So a second background, first background was the Russian Revolution is allowing the battlefield to be found here. The second thing is the Germans say, look, we've conquered so much of what today we call Poland, Lithuania, Western Latvia. The Germans are trying to circle the wagons, take all their chips, cash out, whatever you want to talk about. They're like, we own so much of this land. Let's have this Operation Fist Punch put the final nail in the coffin of what maybe can be most accurately said, our property. Let's sign the deed finally. If you know, during the Second World War, one of Adolf Hitler's greatest goals, one of his most stated goals, was something called Lebensraum, living space. The Germans were obsessed with conquering land in what was also called formerly East Prussia, but going into that Russian sphere and conquering that, so the German Volk could have free reign to develop all that farmland, the breadbasket of the Ukraine. Again, once more, a thing that's found in the First World War that comes back later on. The Germans are always looking east. They're like, France is France, that's kind of set and settled. We want to occupy France, maybe, but it's not the same kind of open farmland where we can, have German families with 10 kids and really build the German people. And of course, all the racial and horrible ideas behind that make it, especially repugnant and terrible. It's not good in any way, but it is certainly the kind of MO, modus operandi, even going back to the First World War. Germany says, remember we felt encircled in the time leading up to the First World War with the naval battle with the British. And we felt like we're trapped between Russia and France, and then Britain above us over the English Channel. Maybe a way to get some breathing space would be to really take hundreds and hundreds of miles, hundreds of thousands of square miles of former Russian territory. That's the point of Operation Fist Punch.
So is that what they're saying? Look, you can see we're beating you. How about we stop here? You give us what we've already got and we'll leave you alone.
That's kind of it. And you'll see in a second when I talk about number 8, Soviet discussions, because we are talking now, it's not the Soviet Union yet, you can say, because they have to fight a very bloody, awful civil war. I think the starting date of the Soviet Union proper is 1922. Some people even push it back 2 more years. Once Lenin dies and Stalin takes over in 24. The Russians are still going to fight a civil war between the Bolsheviks and the Restorationists, the White Russians. But it's no longer the Tsar, right? This is no longer Tsarist Russia at all. That has faded into historical time. And that's exactly it. The Germans are going to go to people like Lenin, Trotsky, etc., and say, look, these are the facts. And the reason that fist punch keeps fist punching is because the Soviets are waffling. They're like, oh, no. And a lot of Soviets, hilariously, is the completely wrong word here, because men's lives are lost. This isn't funny at all. But it's like, look, the Russians kept the war going, right? Kerensky comes in, right? George Washington of the Russians, the first democratic, well, what is the first thing he does? We think we're going to end the war. No, continue the war. And now Lenin, he literally campaigns on, I'm going to get you out of the war, and there's still tons of Bolsheviks who want to continue the war as well. It seems everyone has this kind of crazed, red glazed war fever. And so a lot of discussions are going to be surrounding that. You guys should get out of the war now, and eventually that will win out. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk will be Lenin winning out and saying, yes, we have enough problems at home to focus on. We want to build the socialist utopia here. Let the Germans have their land. And we'll talk about, and actually, I'm very glad we're talking about the Eastern Theater first, because let me give you a quick spoiler alert, quick connecting point. When the Germans win in the East, after what I'll describe to you now, where do all those men go when the treaty's signed? They go home, right? They just go open up daiquiri, pop beer bottles, make daiquiris, lay by the pool, right? The Eastern troops, they're done. They get to relax now, right? No, they're transferred to the West for this German spring offensive. That's what really freaks out the Allies. These are like all those divisions that the Germans were keeping on the Eastern Front. The best thing for the Germans is once they neutralize the Russians finally, and by finally I mean like in a final sense, the treaty is signed. All those guys don't just get to go home. They're not just sent home. They're sent to go join this massive operation in the West. You can say a second fist punch. The German spring offensive is the first one is called Operation Michael after the Archangel, and you can think of it a kind of second fist punch. All the guys that we've had in the Western Front already around Ypres and Cambrai and all that, we're going to add the bulk of the troops to the East we no longer need because the Russians are eliminated. So those guys get no break. They win, they're put on trains the next day and go join the Western Front. That's why it's good that we talk about the East first in chronological time, because that's the import for what we'll be talking about as we close the war this week. Again, when you leave for Thanksgiving on Thursday, we'll have signed the armistice. It'll be over. We'll have talked the whole war chronologically covered. The last 2 weeks of class will just be recaps and kind of filling in some spots, right? Point number 4. Okay, February 18th, Germany commences this 3-prong offensive with 53 divisions. In the north against a town called Pskov. Pskov is famous for its where I think Tsar Nicholas, his train breaks down when he's trying to come back to St. Petersburg to Petrograd. He's waylaid there during his abdication. Smolensk is the central prong. This is a cartographically correct as well. like Pskov north, Smolensk in the middle, Kiev down here. That's where the product works in that exact geographical direction. Smolensk is very famous. God rest all their souls. In 2010, the Polish president and a bunch of delegates were going to fly to Smolensk, and their plane crashed in April of 2010.
That's
It was,
right.
I don't know if you remember that. It was big news because
Wiped
the
out the whole.
president of so much of like the Congress, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
That's that city, and of course Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Everyone knows Kiev is the most famous of those three cities, obviously. Okay, the Northern Force, which has 16 divisions, captures a key junction on the first day, a railroad junction, and this soon follows with the capture of the city of Pskov in general. By the way, spoiler: everything here is massive German victory. Period. This is the most clean German victory of perhaps the whole war. The Central Forces advanced towards Smolensk. Number 5 of most import. Operation Fist Punch, right, which is 18 February to 3 March. 3 days after it begins, the Central Forces have captured Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus. Minsk is an incredibly important city, beautiful city. It's the capital of Belarusia. That's captured on the 21st, and what about below that? Kiev on March 2nd. So within 11 days, they've achieved all their objectives and captured these the only more important cities in the east, I would argue, more than Minsk and Kiev. You have to go into Russia proper. It's Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. And Zoom just dropped. Let's see if I can get back on. Oh wow, and there's coffee everywhere. What a joke. I got my A game today.
use my sleeve.
Yeah, please. Claire, you had a question.
Oh, I just got it.
Oh no, it's not. It didn't drop. Okay, never
No,
mind.
you answered it.
You said what?
You answered it.
How did I answer? What was the question?
My question was how long again, and then
Oh.
you said 11 days.
Oh,
And
good.
then I saw February 21st to March 2nd, which is also 11 days. So I figured it.
Awesome, good. No, glad that I never want things to be unclear. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Can you, like, literally in one sentence, what's going on in the West as far as the Germans seem to have a lot of energy for the East now?
Yeah.
Are they just treading water in the West?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Treading water is a great thing. They're kind of, remember, the Battle of Cambrai is, I think, ends in December at this time. There's some activity in the Middle Eastern theater. Remember where the British general marches through the gates of Jerusalem? Things are kind of static everywhere. This is the first great movement. This is like, this victory here in the East for the Germans is like a battle of frontiers unseen since Belgium in the first start of the war. In the West, the Germans are just trying to, in the West, often you see that the spring offensives come at that time, March, April. For whatever reason, the Germans seem to be more willing to fight winter battles in the Eastern Front than they are in the East. The Battle of Bourlamauf, the first use of gas in the Eastern Front is January 1915. The Missouri Lakes is February. The conditions probably even seem more intense in the East in the winter, in the Russian winter. And yet there seem to be a lot of winter battles in the East. It seems they're often very happy to wait till March or April. The Nivelle offensive begins in April 1917. So they're just kind of setting up the Eastern Front right now, the Western Front. I'll give you a look ahead. The Nivelle offensive in 1917. Remember the brutal, the guy who's the Nivelle, whose mom is British, and so the British are excited about this French general. I'll call off the offensive if it doesn't work in 48 hours. The Germans had spent the winter of 1617 fortifying the Hindenburg line and kind of damaging the ground. That is what the Allies will do here. The Germans will get a taste of their own medicine in a certain sense. Again, we'll save this for Thursday's lecture. Is going to be very, very nice. I mean, massive amounts of information. So much so that you can see I just put mathematical like bridge points for A1 through A6, A5, all stuff. There's like 75 points there in just that first part. Thursday is going to be a lot of information. So, but yes, to answer your question, the Western Front is static, and they're still kind of they're revving up for what seems to be old hat by now. Come spring, we'll commence the trench warfare again, kind of thing. So it's more static.
Yeah, so that's just where we're going to go next with one more question. I'm of the impression somehow in the East, the Germans were making a lot of headway, a lot of territory. Whereas in the West, it seems that everybody, as you said, trench warfare, attrition, everything is just bogged down. So the trench warfare, that did not occur so much in the East. Is that correct?
I never want to give you false information. The most honest answer is I don't know. There were trenches in the East as well. But yes, I think the phenomenon of from from Ypres and the English Channel all the way down to the Swiss border, unbroken, true Western Front trenches is unique in the war. There is nothing like that anywhere else. There's trenches at Gallipoli. There, people are digging trenches into the Carpathian Mountains in those battles of the Isonzo. There are trenches in the east. I don't think it's anything as sophisticated as what we see in the west. There seems to be more kind of open warfare in the east. Even like the siege of Przemysl, that Polish fortress early in the war, 1415. The fortress is the trench. It's the kind of place of security, and it's kind of an old school siege of a city, as you saw, like even going back to antiquity. But I think yes, no, there are trenches all across the theaters. I think at the Missourian lakes, those battles that keep coming back to me, there's photos of people in trenches. They're building trenches. I think the most sophisticated, the most famous and infamous, and the most complete network of trenches is unsurpassed in comparison to the West. The West is unique and more exaggerated in its use of trenches than anywhere else, but they do exist other places as well, just not to that same degree, I believe.
Sure.
Right. But again, I have to honestly say, I don't know. I've never sat down and how many miles of trenches are there? You know, it's possible because the Eastern Front is so enormous. There actually are more miles of trenches total. I just don't think they're broken. They're kind of in piecemeal, where the Western Front literally seems to be from English Channel to Switzerland, just one perfect line. Like you'd almost could walk the whole thing. You know, just that makes it so much sadder because they're just literally embedded in the ground that whole time. Okay, so Kiev and Minsk were captured. What about the German advance? Well, the Central Power Armies, number 6, had advanced over 150 miles within a week, facing no serious resistance from the Soviets at all. And the rapid advance is called, quote, is known as, quote, a railway war. All right, because the Germans used, tragically for the Russians, the Russian railway system to exploit it. Sophia, good morning. So the Central Powers are able to advance so rapidly and beat down the Russians so quickly because they're using their own stuff against them. Soviet morale is destroyed. Here's perhaps most important, the perfect summation. And Sophia, before I read the summation, I'll give you the review. We're ending the war this year, 1918 East and West. We're starting with the East because when the Germans have this massive breakthrough victory in the East, they will transfer so many of their divisions to join the spring offensive in the last part of the war that we'll discuss on Thursday. Operation Faustschlag is fist punch, 11 days of boom, boom, boom to the Russians, keep them out of the war. It works. In all these lands, what we call Eastern Europe now, the reason it's being fought there is because of the Russian Revolution and turmoil. When everything begins on February 18th, there's this 3-pronged attack with 53 divisions that lead to the capture of Minsk and Kiev almost immediately. And you walked in now when I was talking about how quickly the Germans are able to advance, 150 miles in a week. This is what General Hoffman writes in his diary. And this should say it all about what a crushing victory this is for the Germans. It is the most comical war I have ever known. We put a handful of infantrymen with machine guns and one gun onto a train and rush them off to the next station. They take it, make prisoners of the Bolsheviks, pick up a few more troops, and so on. This proceeding has, at any rate, the charm of novelty. So it's almost like a joke. Like, yeah, you guys go, when you get there, don't even worry about your guns being loaded. They're going to surrender or whatever. Take them prisoner, do the next thing. It's almost like a game, like just an Easter egg hunt. Go find the soldiers, take them prisoner, take the rail, move on. There's no resistance whatsoever. All right. It begs the question, why did the Germans not go all the way and take Petrograd? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. Why don't they go all the way to St. Petersburg? They could have. The resistance was an absolute joke.
And on the other side, why did the Bolsheviks wait? I mean, why are you there? You know you're going to be captured.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. Well, and actually, to your point, as the German offensive keeps going, Trotsky returns to Petrograd, St. Petersburg. Most of the leadership still wanted to continue the war, despite the Russian army being completely in tatters. The Russian army was in tatters since the Brusilov offensive of 1916. They still want to continue the war. So at this point, all these discussions take place. Now we're at number 8, Soviet discussions. Finally, Lenin, after threatening to resign, gets the Council of Soviets to agree to German terms. Because the earlier German quest for peace, which Dave Schmidt perfectly identified, Dave said, when the Germans just say, look, this is the reality, guys, come on, boys, let's talk Turkey, come to the table, we own your land, let's quit the war. Those are pretty harsh terms. The Soviets refuse, they get fist punched. Lenin rightly says, if you don't accept the terms now, maybe they'll do what I just suggested. They're gonna come and take everything, take all of Russia. The German Reich will extend to Vladivostok by Korea if we don't, So finally, the Bolsheviks on March 3rd, the day that Operation Fist Punch comes to an end, number 9, TR, Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They sign these terms. Okay. So, the Bolshevik capitulation on March 3rd ends the advance in northern Ukraine, and the Soviet government gives up all rights to southern Russia. All right. So during the next few months, the Central Powers, once the spring offensive begins, into the spring in the east, will march over 500 miles more and take all of Ukraine, take a bunch of this territory, and move into the Baltic states. With the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Soviet Russia had given up Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Those are the Baltic states. Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. All right, all of these places. And it will only be when Armistice Day and the subsequent Treaty of Versailles nullify this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that the Russians will try to recoup some of their losses. Yes.
Is this where, my knowledge of Russia in general is poor, or all of Eastern Europe, but is this where this isn't where it started, right? Like there were cultural differences between regions before.
Between who?
Between Poland, Ukraine.
Okay, this is your question is a great question. Poland and Russia, enormous differences. Ukraine and Russia, not enormous differences. Two big things in this region. Do you look west or do you look east? The Poles and the Russians arguably are the two most important Slavic countries. And that's a great fault line there. The Poles have always looked west. The Poles use the Latin alphabet. You could read Polish phonetically, no problem. It's a very, very difficult language. Learning it would be a whole other thing. But you could read it. They use our alphabet. The Russians use the Cyrillic alphabet. Our alphabet, the Latin alphabet, exactly, is rooted in Rome, where the Cyrillic alphabet is named, as I think I mentioned before, after the brother saints, Cyril and Methodius, who are the evangelizers of the Slavs. Saint Cyril develops the Cyrillic alphabet named after him based on the Greek. So the Russians are Greek, you can say. The Poles are Latin, are Roman. The Poles, John Paul II, super Roman Catholic. The Russians look at themselves as the third Rome, the Orthodox faith. There's enormous differences between the Poles and the Russians. I've said many times, and I love Russian culture. I love the Russian language, and Russian and Polish are very similar. You can hear ja chcę coś pić in Polish. I want something to drink. Ja chcę coś pić. Ja хочу что-нибудь pić in Russian. It's almost the exact same. It's fine. Phonetically speaking, they're very close. But that's kind of I don't know what the word is. It's misleading. They're both Slavic people. The language sounds the same. The way it's written speaks to the massive risk of East versus West, and it gets even deeper and worse with acknowledging the Pope versus not Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and just years of kind of rivalry and dislike. So, but the Ukraine, they're also like the Russians, Orthodox, many of them. Some of them, there's this Ukrainian church, I think, where the Pope gave a dispensation. I think it's some Treaty of Brest or whatever, where the Ukrainians could celebrate in the Eastern Rite. They're part of the Catholic Church.
Is that like the Byzantine?
The Byzantine Rite is the Orthodox, as far as I know. The Byzantines are the Russians or the Greeks. All of that is Orthodoxy.
But isn't there one that's still in Rome? Is this what you're talking about?
Yes.
I've heard of this.
Okay, and so you may know more about it than I do. I don't want to misspeak. I'm not sure where it actually factors in, but big difference between the Russians and the Poles. Russians and the Ukrainians is the problem. So in fact, here I have this written here. Russia in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk cedes Ukraine, recognize its independence. Well, then Ukraine is one of the 16 Soviet socialist republics. Ukraine's independent, brought back into the Russian sphere. Post 1991, it's independent again. What was happening in 2014? Putin and and the Crimean Peninsula and Donbass again. Ukraine is always this yo-yo type thing of are they part of Russia or not? People will get offended. Pro-Western people, pro-Ukrainian independence people will say Ukraine, Kiev, Ukraine. Don't say the Ukraine, because Ukraine literally means borderland. When you say the, you're implying linguistically it's part of Russia. It's just the borderland western part of Russia. Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia has kind of a Texas thing with America. Texas was its own independent state once. Texas for 9 years. Texas is separate in some ways. Texas, I believe, is the only state that has its own power grid in America, but it's part of the United States. Ukraine, a lot of people don't like talking about it being part of Russia. It is independent now. It's it's very kind of like, so Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, very similar. Cyrillic Orthodoxy. Poland, massively different. Poland is with Czech Republic, those Slavic countries that have the Latin alphabet and look west. But nonetheless, like I said, my mom grew up in Poland under Soviet occupation. Not the Poland, thank God, was never part of the USSR, but it was ruled by Polish communists loyal to Moscow. It was behind the Iron Curtain, as Churchill said. So this part of Central and Eastern Europe, very fraught with a lot of like territorial movements and stuff and complexity. So your question is the opposite of stupid or naive or something. The question is very, very complex and very hard to answer even.
So even before World War I, there were some cultural differences, but this kind of
very old,
land.
very old, thousands of years, going back to like, I think the first king of Poland, Mieszko, was like 966 AD, and Cyril and Methodius were 9th century. This is thousands of years of stuff. Yeah, this is not a World War I. World War I maybe highlights some of these things. But the idea of what Poland is, where all that kind of stuff, the partitions of the 18th century, it's very, very old. Russians celebrate their Independence Day going back to a battle in the 1600s when the Poles almost capture Moscow and they beat the Poles. So I mean, this is and it actually installs 300 years of Romanov rule that ends here. This is centuries old, almost a millennia old of kind of stuff. What are some kind of lasting things? The terms of this treaty, I already told you basically. I told you the terms of the treaty. That Russia basically gives up all of its territory in what used to be part of Imperial Russia in its western sphere, the Baltic states, Ukraine, whatever. The Soviets additionally agreed to sell Germany 25% of the output of the Baku oil fields in Azerbaijan. And I wrote here, this is so 1991 Desert Storm 2003. Again, just oil, right? So part of the treaty, guys, want your oil fields because of the industrial machine, same thing, right? And Azerbaijan, is that Middle East? Well, not really, but kind of already coming down in that area, right? The Caucasus region. Here's very interesting long-term effects. When the Germans whine and complain, later on, the Treaty of Versailles was very punitive. The Allies say, "Oh, punitive. I'll show you punitive."
Yeah.
And they're right. The Allies are right. People complain. A lot of people say the reason Hitler comes to power in the Second World War comes because this Article 231B of the Versailles Treaty, which we'll cover in detail in our last lecture in this class. It was very punitive, maybe. It had nothing on Brest-Litovsk. As far as I remember, at Versailles, no one asked the Germans to give up all of their land and everything and become total slaves to France. No one asked that. That's what the Germans basically imposed on the Russians. I've told you many times in World War I, especially, I'm very pro-German often. I come off as like the Germans are so fascinating, interesting, and the German people, the wound was put to them first. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Sophie, and their unborn child. The German people were hit first. This is where we can be 100%. Let's get our anti-Germanism like cranked up to 100%. This is absolute BS. The Germans have nothing to complain about Versailles after they try to pull this crap on the Russians, right? Which good, because the Russians at that point are ruled by some of the worst people that ever walked the face of the earth. So I wish the Germans would have taken St. Petersburg and wiped the Bolsheviks off the face of the earth and saved us, 180 years of Bolshevik terror and Stalin and all that stuff. But just in terms of fairness, the Russians can't cry about fairness at Versailles when they did this to the Russians. Of course, I don't have to tell you, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is nullified almost immediately by, we'll talk about on Thursday, by the ultimate German loss in the West, Armistice Day, and the subsequent Treaty of Versailles. But what are the long-term effects? Well, the Polish-Soviet War, Claire, is especially bitter. It ends with the Treaty of Riga in 1921, and famously the miracle of the Vistula on the feast day of Our Lady's Assumption, August 15th, 1920. Józef Piłsudski and the Poles hold back the attacking Soviets. And historians have said if that didn't happen, if the Poles don't beat the Russians, the Bolsheviks in 1920, it's possible the Bolsheviks meet up with a lot of compatriots in Germany, a lot of communist sentiment there, and they make all of Europe red. If not for that victory at the Vistula in 1920, it's very possible that the whole history of Cold War Europe is much different. That the Iron Curtain extends all the way to Spain, maybe. Who knows? Again, we're playing alternate history. But long-term effects of all this, of course, all the bitter fighting in the East, the rise of Stalin, the rise of Hitler, the Treaty of Rapallo. We'll talk about the end of class. But there's a lot of stuff, a lot of after effects. All right, we're done with the class. I promised you a short class. I mean, that's all we have to talk about. Sophia, Claire, anyone who missed what I said earlier, really quickly before I sign up on Zoom, there's no slides today. What we're going to talk about next class is, as we were short today, we're gonna have a lot to get through next class. So I'll probably start the class with no jokes and then just write the information. Because we'll have three, jokes, funny or not funny. Jokes, maybe even the jokes that are so bad you can't tell it was a joke. We won't even do those. We'll just start with the German Spring Offensive and then move into where America really, finally, right? I've teased you with America in this class so many times. Talked about America going back to Veracruz and Woodrow Wilson. He kept us out of the war and American propaganda. Americans really entered the war in full force in the summer of 1918, right at the time to get ready for the 100 Days Offensive, which, last kind of looking ahead, begins on August 8th, the so-called Black Day of the German Army, when the Germans really see for the first time the true writing on the wall on the Western Front. We're going to lose the war. And the subsequent from August 8th to 3 months, those 100 days to Armistice Day. And I'll tell you, pray for this guy's soul, Henry Gunther. We'll talk about him. Tragic story. He's the last man killed in the war. He's killed at 10:59 a.m. on November 11th, 1 minute before the armistice comes into play. And what's really sad, I'll revisit Gunther's story. People were fighting. The treaty is signed at like 5 a.m. on November 11th, and it's going to come into effect 11 a.m. Gunther runs out of his hole. I mean, it's his fault. God have mercy on his soul. He got himself killed. Which maybe takes away some of the tragedy of what was he doing? What was he thinking? And God rest his soul all the same. But the Gunther, I'll tell the story again, verbatim on Thursday, comes out of the hole, attacks a German machine gun nest, and the German guys wave him off. They're like, stop. They're like, freaking, what are you doing? Right? He's like shooting at them, like, stop it. In 1 minute, it's over. And he keeps shooting. Like, fine, I guess, we'll shoot you then. I mean, literally. And people say Gunther, he was upset about some kind of demotion. He wanted to prove himself. It's like, he literally goes out of the trenches to attack the German machine gun nest 1 minute before Armistice Day comes into effect and gets killed. So God rest his soul. God rest his soul a million times, but it was his fault. The German guys even tried to wave him off. But what are the German guys supposed to do if he's actually trying to shoot them? Okay, they have to, right? I mean, gosh, just awful, tragic. But he arguably is, of the 41 million people killed in the war we talked about, all the casualties, or 20 million killed, 21 million wounded. The war is so bad, and it goes down to the last seconds. In the last 60 seconds of the war, you saw people getting shot and killed. It's not like, oh, everyone, here's Armistice Day, and we're just gonna, as we should, just put down and just stay in our trench. All right, I'll see you guys all on Thursday.